Hey there, welcome to Tallied. I'm Kiran and today I'm here with the fourth topic of process costing, equivalent production, FIFO method. Our fourth topic, our agenda is to learn the statement of equivalent production, statement of equivalent cost per unit, statement of evaluation and the process account using FIFO method. Previously in this chapter, we have covered introduction to process costing, how to prepare a process account, and the accounts to prepare after the process account. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that I take accounts tuitions for class 12 CBSE students. So if you like this method of learning and know anyone who might benefit from my classes, please do let them know about me. I've scored a 94% in accounts in my 12th boards. And for more details and inquiry, take a look and fill up the Google form in the description below. This video is going to be slightly different. We are going to understand a question with a real life example. So we are going to be solving these accounts as if it is for your very own business or company. Hope this will get you on your feet, make you think quick, and understand what we do and why we do it. If you like this way of learning, then do let me know in the comments below so that we can do more of these. And don't worry, I will be solving the second question normally so that you get a hang of that too and are exam ready. So let's get right into today's video. I will be solving in a pace where you can solve along with me, and the timestamps are in the description below to help navigate yourself.
Before we get started with the question, let's first understand what is equivalent production by taking an example. If you are already clear with the concept of equivalent production, then you can go on to the first question using the timestamps. Let's say we have raw materials of 1000 units. Now in our example, let us assume that we are in the buttoning process of shirts. So we get a shirt with 0 buttons, and at the end of the process, we have a shirt with 4 buttons. So our raw material is a shirt with 0 buttons. This is our input. Now for our output, we have finished goods of 900 units and work in progress of 100 units. Here, finished goods is a shirt with 4 buttons and work in progress is anything between raw materials and finished goods. So a shirt with 1, 2 or 3 buttons. On finished goods, obviously all work has been completed. So we say degree of completion is 100%. In a process, work is usually divided in 3 parts: material, labor and overheads. So in our example, materials can be making of buttons. Labor can be stitching of these buttons onto the shirt, and overheads can be haulage, which is interdepartment transportation, or overheads can be accounting for the goods in this process. We saw our degree of completion for finished goods is 100%. And as for work in progress, let's say the degree of completion is materials 100%, labor 50% and overheads 50%, which simply means making of buttons is completed, stitching of buttons and accounting is half completed. Next, we have cost per unit. Materials rupees 10 per unit, labor rupees 6 per unit and overheads rupees 4 per unit. Each part of the process has a separate cost. To better understand this, in our example, it costs rupees 10 to make buttons for one shirt. It costs rupees 6 to stitch buttons for one shirt, or labor cost for one shirt is rupees 6 and so on. Now let us account for material cost. So we know that in quantity we have 900 units of finished goods and 100 units work in progress. Cost per unit for material is rupees 10. So for the finished goods, 100% work is completed. So 900 units quantity into cost per unit 10, which is equal to a total amount of 9,000. Now for work in progress, degree of completion of material is 100%. So we will simply do the same thing. Quantity 100 units into cost per unit 10, which is equal to 1,000, and we total it. Remember how I told you materials is a part of the process where buttons are made. Labor is where buttons are stitched, etc. Forget that bit for now. Let us just assume that in each part of this process, the work is to attach buttons to a shirt. So in materials, labor and overheads each, the work is to go from 0 buttons in a shirt to 4 buttons in a shirt. In real, this wouldn't be the case. Every part of the process will have a different task like we saw before. But we are going to take a common task or work to easily understand the concepts. To put it simply, I'm just saying, assume in the materials part of the process, we attach 4 buttons in a shirt. And so is the case with labor and overheads. So if degree of completion of materials is 25%, it means 1 button has been attached. And if it is 100%, it means 4 buttons have been attached. We are taking the same in all parts of the process for the sake of understanding. Here we have 900 shirts of finished goods. On finished goods, degree of completion is 100%. So we have 900 shirts with 4 buttons. And as for work in progress, we have 100 units and the degree of completion is 100%. So this means the entire work has been done and it will cost us rupees 10 itself. So we have another 100 shirts with 4 buttons. So in total, we have 1000 shirts with 4 buttons. So degree of completion of finished goods is 100% and degree of completion for work in progress is also 100%. Now this was basic because degree of completion of work in progress was 100%. Equivalent production comes into play when degree of completion is less than 100%. So we will understand equivalent production while calculating labor cost and overhead cost. Next, we have labor cost. The quantity is the same, 900 units of finished goods and 100 units of work in progress. But the degree of completion is 50%. Cost per unit is given as rupees 6. So as work on finished goods is 100%, we will multiply quantity 900 with the cost per unit of rupees 6 to get an amount of 5400. Now for the remaining 100 units, only 50% of the work has been completed. What does this mean? It simply means we have 100 shirts with 2 buttons. Because only 50% work is done. We have attached 2 out of 4 buttons. To do 100% of the work or to attach 4 buttons, it costs us 6 rupees. So for 50%, our cost per unit will be rupees 3. So our amount will be 100 into 3, which is equal to 300. By totaling this, we get quantity 1000 and amount 5700 to get a cost per unit of 5.7. So here we have 900 shirts with 4 buttons, which is our finished goods, and 100 shirts with 2 buttons, which is our work in progress, where degree of completion is 50%. The question here is, what is equivalent production? Instead of doing 50% work on these 100 units, which is, instead of attaching 2 buttons to 100 shirts, to how many shirts could I have attached 4 buttons by performing the same amount of work? To put it simply, I can say instead of attaching 2 buttons to 100 shirts, I can attach 4 buttons to 50 shirts. Same amount of work, but here the cost per unit will be the entire 6 rupees because it's for 100% work. So instead of attaching 2 buttons to 100 shirts, we can attach 4 buttons to 50 shirts. Why do we do this? It is easier to account for cost, as in this case, we have 50 fully completed shirts and no in-progress work. Let me ask you, would you find it easy to remember 50 complete shirts or 100 shirts where 50% work is completed and has 2 buttons? Obviously, you would say it is easier to remember 50 complete shirts. Same goes for accounting. Even when it comes to cost, for a complete shirt, we have the cost per unit of 6 rupees. But for an incomplete shirt, it would become hard to account for cost. For 50%, we know cost per unit will be rupees 3. But what about for 10% or 30% or 70%? So it becomes easier to account for complete goods. So we find equivalent production, which is nothing but how many completely finished units we can make with the equivalent amount of work. As we saw before, if I put the same effort or work of attaching 2 buttons to 100 shirts, I can instead have 50 shirts with 4 buttons or 50 complete shirts, which is my equivalent production. So in our example, instead of saying I have 1000 units, out of which 900 are complete and 100 are half complete, I can say 950 units are fully complete. So 950 is my equivalent production. We know cost per unit is 6. And if you notice, the amount is the same, rupees 5,700, because the work performed on it is the same. Let us quickly go through overhead costs. Finished goods 900 units at a cost per unit of rupees 4 gives us a total of rupees 3,600. Then we have 100 units of work in progress where degree of completion is 50%. So again, 100 shirts with 2 buttons. The cost per unit will be half, which is rupees 2, because we have attached only half the buttons. To find equivalent production, we know that instead of attaching 2 buttons to 100 shirts, I can rather attach 4 buttons to 50 shirts. 2 into 100 is 200 and 4 into 50 is 200. So number of buttons attached is the same, and so is the work done. So the number of buttons attached is the same and the work done is also the same. So we can say that we have 950 complete shirts and 950 is our equivalent production. Cost per unit is 4 rupees and total amount is 3,800. If these explanations on equivalent production is clear, let's move on to solve our first question.
Here we are with the first question. Let's first read the question. The below relates to process B account. They have given us opening work in progress, transfer from process A, labor, overheads, unit scrapped, and closing work in progress. They have also given us the degree of completion of opening work in progress, closing work in progress, and scrap for the 3 parts of the processes: material, labor, and overheads. Normal loss is 70 units and the realizable value is rupees 5 per unit. You are required to prepare necessary statements and process B account. Over here, our necessary statements are statement for equivalent production, statement of equivalent cost per unit, statement of evaluation, and finally, as requested, the process account. Always before starting the question, we write a note mentioning which method we use to solve this question. In this question and in today's video, we are going to be using the FIFO or first in, first out method. So I have mentioned this as a note right here. So this is our first account and it is called Statement of Equivalent Production. The format for this account is input, particulars, output, and then we have materials under which we have percentage and units. Similarly, we have labor under which we have percentage and units, and finally overheads under which we have percentage and units. So the first item we are going to put in this account is our opening work in progress. So our particulars, we are going to type opening work in progress. So what do I mean by opening work in progress? Work in progress is anything between raw material and finished goods. Let's take up an example. Okay, let's imagine we are in the buttoning process as we saw earlier. So we have to go from 0 buttons to 4 buttons. Last year, for one shirt, you attached only 3 buttons. So you have attached only 3 out of 4 buttons, right? So you have not completed the entire work, which is 4 buttons, but you have completed 3 buttons, right? So this is your work in progress. So this will become your opening work in progress of this year. So last year, if you have any incomplete shirts which you have started working on, and for this year, that becomes your opening work in progress. So they have given us 200 units. So we write this as input. This opening work in progress, 3 buttons, will go on to be your finished goods. right? Because on these 3 buttons shirt, you will attach the 4th button and finish it this year. So this will become our output as well. Next, we have raw materials, and this is our transfer from process A. Let's say in process A, they make shirts, right? So the output of process A is a shirt with 0 buttons. So here we need to know that the output of one process can become the input of another process. So output of process A is a shirt, right? This is our input for our second process or process B, which is the buttoning process. So from process A, we get a shirt with 0 buttons, and in this process, we attach 4 buttons to that shirt. So this shirt is our raw material. So we write raw materials introduced, and this is our input. So we will write it in our input column. We have 800 units. This raw material will go on to become our finished goods. We have not been given any amount for finished goods, so we will go on to see what else raw materials can be. Raw materials can turn into finished goods, but raw materials can also turn into normal loss, abnormal loss, and if there is any unfinished work, then this will be our closing work in progress. Now we have been given that normal loss is 70 units. So we will write 70 as our output. Then we have an abnormal loss. Abnormal loss has a formula which is units scrapped minus normal loss. So by applying this formula, we get 100 minus 70, which is 30 units. And finally, we are given a closing work in progress of 300 units. So we write this as 300 on the output side. Now let's total our input and output columns to see what the balance is, or to find out what our finished goods is. So on the input column, we have a sum of 1000. And on the output column, we have a sum of 600. So we notice there is a difference of 400, and this will be our finished goods. Next, let us take a look at what to do with degree of completion. So we have been given degree of completion for opening work in progress, closing work in progress, and scrap. Let's first look at opening work in progress. Now, when we spoke about the opening work in progress example, we said 3 out of 4 buttons have been attached last year. So this means 75% of the work is completed on that shirt. Simple. So we're just saying that one button, if I fit one button on a shirt, 25% of the work is completed. If I fit 2 buttons, 50% work is completed. And if I fit 4 buttons, it means 100% work is completed. So right now, we are told that 3 buttons have been fitted. So which means 25% work is left for this year. Similarly, in our question, they have given us that 80% work is completed in our previous year. So how much work is left for this year? Simple enough, 20%, right? So we will write 20% in materials. Similarly, we'll do the same for labor and overheads for our opening work in progress. So under labor, we will write 40% because 40% work is left for this year. And for overheads, we have 50%. Here, we calculate equivalent production. So instead of saying, I am going to do 20% work on 200 shirts, can I show this in terms of units? Yes. So this will be my equivalent production. Okay. To put it simpler, I'm just saying, instead of saying that I will fit one button for 4 shirts, I can say I will finish one shirt. Same amount of work, because one button in 4 shirts is me basically attaching 4 buttons in total, right? So instead of that, I can say one shirt. Same thing we do here. So instead of saying I'm going to do 20% work on 200 shirts, if I have to put this in units, I will simply find our equivalent production, which is 20% of 200. We get 40 units. Similarly, we do the same for the others. So we do 40% of 200 and we get 80. And finally, we have 50% of 200 and we get 100. So these numbers 40, 80 and 100 are our equivalent production. Moving on, we have finished goods. And for finished goods, we know always that the work or degree of completion is 100%. So here we will mention 100%, 100% and 100%. And we calculate equivalent production the same way. So this will be 100% of 400, which will be 400 itself. And same goes for labor and overheads. Next, we have normal loss. Something we need to know over here is that we assume that no work has been done on normal loss. Okay. And if you want to know the reason for this, I would ask you to go and check out my first video on introduction of process costing. So here I'm going to take 0%. And similarly, for labor and overheads, we have 0% for normal loss. So the 0% of 70 will be 0, obviously. So we have 0, 0, and 0. Next, we have abnormal loss. In abnormal loss, some work might be done or no work might be done. And this is given in our question as scrap. So for materials, 100% work has been done. And for labor, 70% work has been done. And for overhead, 60% work has been done. So this work has been done this year. So we will write 100, 70, and 60 as our percentage values. 100%, 70%, and 60%. We calculate the equivalent production for abnormal loss. So 100% of 30 will be 30. 70% of 30 is going to give us 21. And 60% of 30 is 18. Now for closing work in progress, we are given 70%, 50%, and 40%. So we will enter these values as it is. So for materials, we have 70%. For labor, we see 50%. So under the labor column, we are going to write 50%. And finally, for overheads, we have our closing work in progress degree of completion as 40%. We will calculate our equivalent production or units. So for materials, we have 70% of 300. For labor, we have 50% of 300. Finally, for overheads, we have 40% of 300. So we get 120. Now, there is something important that you need to remember. If you noticed, for opening work in progress, we took the difference, or if 80% was given, we took 20% over here. And if 60% was given, we took 40%. But this was not the case for the other items like abnormal loss or for closing work in progress. We took these numbers as it is. Why is the case? Because as I said, here by saying degree of completion, they're talking about how much work has been completed. So when they say opening work in progress, 80% has been completed. It means 80% has been completed last year. And we want to know how much work we have this year or how much work we are going to do this year. So on opening work in progress, we are going to do only 20% work, so we write 20%. But as for our closing work in progress, this 70% value they have given is at the end of our current year. So that means in this year, we have worked 70%. So we take these numbers as it is and we take 70%, 50%, and 40%. If you have understood this, let's total our statement of equivalent production to find out our equivalent production for materials, labor, and overheads. The number of units for material, we have 680. Number of units for labor, we have 651. And number of units for overheads, we have 638. With this, we are done with our statement of equivalent production. I'm going to repeat the important things from this account. We need to remember that normal loss, we always take 0% because we assume no work has been done on our normal loss units. Second, for finished goods, all work has been completed, so we will take 100%. So as we did in the question, we took 100% of 400 because our finished goods is completed, so our degree of completion is 100%, even if not mentioned in the question. And finally, we need to remember that opening work in progress is one item in which we will take the difference. Or if 80% is given, we will mention 20% because this is the work we will be doing this year. But for our closing work in progress and abnormal loss, the percentage they mention is what is the work we do this year. So we mention them as it is. Now, if this account is completed, more than 60% of the question is already done. Now let's move on to see what the second account is. Our second account is our statement of equivalent cost per unit. So the format for this account is element of cost, rupees, rupees, equivalent units, and finally cost per unit. So in this account, what do we find? We find the cost per unit of different parts of the processes. So we saw before that there are three parts of the processes where we have materials, labor, and overheads. And in our example, we assumed materials may be making of buttons, labor might be stitching of buttons, and overheads can be accounting for the goods. So through this account, we're trying to find how much it takes to make buttons for one shirt, or how much it takes to stitch buttons for one shirt, or how much it takes to account for one shirt. So this is nothing but our cost per unit for different parts of the process. So our first part of the process is materials. So we write materials in our element of cost. Under rupees, we will write 1,05,070 because this is our material value. So transfer from process A is our raw material, which is nothing but materials. So we will write 1,05,070. Now, from raw material, it is important that we subtract normal loss realization. As discussed before in our previous videos, normal loss realization is money we get back by selling our normal loss units. So this money is something we're getting back and it doesn't form a part of our cost. So we subtract this. So we write less normal loss realization. The amount is going to be 70 units into 5. So we have 70 into 5, which is 350. So we get the material value of 1,05,070 minus 350. And we write this here. 1 lakh minus 350 is going to give us 1,04,720. Next, we have labor. Labor is given as 26,040. We will write this here as 26,040. And finally, we have overheads. In our question, overheads is given as 12,760. So we write this here in our third column as 12,760. Now that we have filled the amount column for the three processes, we divide it by the units to find how much it takes for 1 unit. So we take our equivalent units that we found through our first account, which is our statement of equivalent production. So the equivalent units for materials is 680. So this is our materials column. And under units, we have calculated the sum of equivalent production, which is 680. So we will write this here as 680. Similarly, for labor, we have equivalent units as 651. And lastly, for overheads, our equivalent units is 638. So now we know that our materials or making of buttons all together has costed us 1,04,720. And with this, we are able to make 680 shirts. What does that mean? How much does it cost for one shirt? We obviously divide the amount by the equivalent number of units. So let's quickly find the amount for this. So we have 1,04,720 divided by 680. And we get 154. So this is our cost per unit for materials. So if I had to relate this to our example, it simply means it takes 154 rupees to make buttons for one shirt. Next, we calculate cost per unit for labor, which is 26,040 divided by 651. Here we get 40. Here, through our example, it simply means that it costs 40 rupees to stitch buttons onto one shirt. And finally, we have our overheads, which is 12,760 divided by 638. We get 20. So these are our cost per units for different parts of the process. And we sum this to get our total cost per unit. So this is the cost to make one shirt. So we know that materials part of the process costs us 154, labor costs us 40, overheads costs us 20, and the total to make one shirt is going to be the sum of these three values, which gives us a sum of 214. With this, we are done with our statement of equivalent cost per unit. Our third account is our statement of evaluation. So in our statement of evaluation, we find the values for various elements. Now let's see how to prepare this account. The format for our statement of evaluation account is item, element of cost, equivalent units, cost per unit, and rupees or amount. So let's take our first item as opening work in progress. Then our element of cost becomes our different parts of the process. To find the cost of opening work in progress, we need to add the cost that it takes in our material part of the process, labor part of the process, and overhead part of the process. So our element of cost becomes material, labor, and overhead. So we have material, labor, and overhead. Our equivalent units we will take from our statement of equivalent production. So we are finding the equivalent units for opening work in progress and material. So we go on to find opening work in progress in our particulars, and for materials under units we have 40. So we write this as our equivalent units. Similarly, for labor, so this time it's opening work in progress, labor. So opening work in progress, labor is 80 units. And finally, for overheads, we do the same thing. We have 100 units. Next, we write the cost per unit. So this we get from our statement of equivalent cost per unit. We have found the cost per unit for materials, labor, and overhead. So we will write these in their respective cells. So is equal to 154, is equal to 40, and is equal to 20. And now we multiply the units with the cost per unit to get the total amount. We do the same for labor and overheads. And then we sum these three values to get the total. So this will be the total amount for our opening work in progress. So equal to sum. And we add these three values. 11,360 is our value for opening work in progress. Next, we are going to take finished goods. Again, to make finished goods, a shirt with no buttons has to go through three parts of the processes: materials, labor, and overheads. Each one has its own cost. So here, we're going to write material, labor, and overhead. We again go on to find the equivalent units from our statement of equivalent production. So for finished goods, under material, our units finished goods are 400, and so is the case for labor and overheads. So in all three, I can just write 400 as units. So this is going to be 400, 400, and 400. The cost per unit will be 154, 40, and 20. So let me just fill these in: 54, 40, and 20. And to find the amount, I'm going to simply multiply 400, which is the quantity, into the cost per unit, 154. Next, we have our abnormal loss. And we need to know that in statement of evaluation, we don't account for normal loss because normal loss equivalent units are 0. So in abnormal loss, again, we have the three parts of the processes: material, labor, and overhead. The units we are going to find from our first account. So for abnormal loss, the units for materials is 30. So I'm going to fill in 30. Abnormal loss units for labor is 21. So I'm going to fill in 21. And finally, for overhead, the abnormal loss units is 18. Our cost per unit will be the same. So I'm going to write 154 for materials, 40 for labor, and 20 for overheads. We again multiply to get the total. Do the same for labor and overheads. And finally, sum the three values to get the total for our abnormal loss. Lastly, we have our closing work in progress. Again, we have material, labor, and overhead. Let's go look at the units. So for materials, our unit is 210. For labor, our unit is 150. And for overheads, it is 120. So we have 210, 150, and 120. We can check these again just to be sure. So closing work in progress is right here. Units for material, 210. Units for labor, 150. Units for overhead, 120. Yep, we got them all right. Cost per unit will be 154, 40, and 20. And we do the same thing again. We sum it to find the total value of closing work in progress. And with this, we are done with our third account, and the only account left is our process account. We already know the format of our process account. We have particulars, units, rupees, particulars, units, rupees. So let's see what we account for in our process account. So first, we have opening work in progress. So we write to opening work in progress. Number of units. We go to our question and we have been given 200 units. So we will write it just as it is. And for amount, we need to remember that we don't take this value of 11,360 that we found in our statement of evaluation, but we take the value in our question, which is 30,000. So for opening stock or opening work in progress, the value we take in our process account is from our question, which is 30,000, and not from our statement of evaluation. So I'm going to write this as 30,000. Next, we have all our expenses on our debit side. We have to materials, to labor, and finally to overheads. So for materials, we have units of 800 at a value 1,05,070. 800 units, 1,05,070. For labor and overheads, we don't have units, but our cost is 26,040 for labor, 26,040 for labor, and 12,760 for overheads. 12,760 for overheads. Now we go on to our credit side. Our first item will be our normal loss. So we have by normal loss. The question, we have been given 70 units at a realizable value of rupees 5 per unit. So units, we write 70 and our amount is going to be 70 into 5, which is 350. Next, we have our abnormal loss. So we write by abnormal loss. Our abnormal loss units is what we found out here, which is 30. How did we find this out? Abnormal loss is units scrapped minus normal loss. So 100 minus 70 is equal to 30. So the units we write as 30. And as for the amount, we write the value that we found in our statement of evaluation. So in statement of evaluation, the value we found for abnormal loss is 5,820. Right here, abnormal loss, the value, total value is 5,820. So I will write this in the rupees column. Next, we have finished goods. For finished goods, don't take the units from the statement of equivalent production and don't take the amount from statement of evaluation. The finished goods will be the balancing figure. So for units and amount, we will find the balancing figure and that will be our finished goods. And I will tell you why shortly. So after this, we have our closing work in progress. So our closing work in progress is 300 units. We have 300 units here, or we can see it in the question. 300 units. And for the amount, we write what we found out through our statement of evaluation. So closing work in progress, total amount 40,740. 40,740. Here, summarizing the process account, opening work in progress, we took the amount from the question and not from our statement of evaluation. The only amounts we have taken from the statement of evaluation is for our abnormal loss and for our closing work in progress. Now, let us sum the units and amount column to find the balancing figure or our finished goods. So on debit side, our units come up to 1,000. And on our credit side, our units come up to 400. So there is a difference of 600. So this will be our finished goods. Next, for our amounts column, we have a sum of 1,73,870 on our debit side. And on our credit side, our value or sum is 46,910. So the difference will be our amount for finished goods. So is equal to 1,73,870 minus 46,910. We get this value of 1,26,960. So here, I want you to know why I asked you not to take the value from statement of evaluation, because if you noticed, here we have the value of 85,600, and here we have a value of 1,26,960. And even our units differ. Here we have 600 units in finished goods, and here we have 400 units. So where does the 600 come from? If you look back at our statement of equivalent production, 400 are finished goods from our raw materials, but the opening work in progress of 200 units also go on to become our finished goods. So our total finished goods will be 200 plus 400, which is 600 units. Now, there is a way to check if you got everything right. We're done with our process account. Now we want to know if we have done the sum right or wrong. So for this, we have a checkpoint. So first, we take opening work in progress. So under opening work in progress, there are two values. So over here, we have 30,000. What is this 30,000? This 30,000 is what it has costed to do this amount of work. So it has costed 30,000 in our previous year to do 80% work in material, 60% work in labor, and 50% work in overhead. And the remaining of 11,360 is what it has costed this year to do our remaining work. So our remaining work is 20% material, 40% labor, and 50% overheads. Don't get confused. Let me put this more simply. Opening work in progress, we have done half the work last year and some work this year. So in our example, we said last year we have attached 3 buttons to a shirt, and this year we will have to attach only 1 button to a shirt. So relating this to our question, last year to attach 3 buttons, it has costed 30,000. So this 30,000 is what is given in our question. This year, to attach 1 button, it has costed us 11,360. So together, these two values will make up total of how much it costed to make that shirt. So our total opening work in progress is going to be 30,000, which we have in our question and in our process account. So I'm going to write is equal to 30,000 plus what we have found in our statement of evaluation, which is 11,360. The sum of this is coming up to 41,360. So opening work in progress, we have 200 units. Next, we have finished goods. These finished goods are of 400 units. So for 400 units, how much has it costed us? For 400 units, we have the amount in our statement of evaluation, and this amount is 85,600. So we will write 85,600. So it has costed us 85,600 for 400 units, and we get this from our statement of evaluation. Now, to find our total finished goods, we are going to add these two values. So this will be is equal to sum of these two values. So we get 1,26,960. And if you notice, this is the value that we got in our process account as a figure for our finished goods. And if these two values match, it means our question is right. So our total finished goods is 600. So here, it simply means that our opening work in progress of 200 units will go on to become our finished goods. So this makes up 200 units and our finished goods of 400 units from our raw material. To find the total cost of finished goods, for opening work in progress, it has costed us 30,000 in our previous year and 11,360 in this year to finish the entire work on these goods. So for these 200 units, it has costed us 41,360. And for these 400 goods, which we have made this year, it has costed us 85,600, which we got from our statement of evaluation. We get a total finished goods of 600 units valued at 1,26,960. And this is what is shown in our process account. With this, we are done with our first question. Let's move on to question number 2. Before we go on to our second question, let's first zoom in a little bit to take a look of the accounts that we have prepared in our question 1. So first, we prepared a statement of equivalent production in which we calculated the equivalent production for materials, labor, and overheads. Next, we prepared the statement of equivalent cost per unit where we found the cost per unit for the three parts of the processes: materials, labor, and overheads. Third, we prepared statement of evaluation where we found the value of certain elements. So these elements are opening work in progress, finished goods, abnormal loss, and closing work in progress. And finally, we prepared the process B account, which by now I'm sure you all are familiar with. Lastly, we just checked if our answer is right by using the checkpoint of for finished goods. If this is clear, let's go on to our question 2. So our question 2 reads, the following data pertains to process 1 for March 2015 of Beta Limited. Opening work in progress is 1,500 units valued at rupees 15,000. Degree of completion of opening work in progress is given. Input of materials, we have been given materials 18,500 units at 52,000. Cost of direct labor and overheads has also been given to us. We have a closing work in progress of 5,000 units. Degree of completion of closing work in progress is given to us. Normal loss or normal process loss is 10% of total input, which is opening work in progress plus units introduced. Scrap value is rupees 2 per unit. Units transferred to the next process is 15,000 units. We are required to compute equivalent units of production, which is a statement of equivalent production. Compute cost per equivalent unit for each cost element, i.e., or namely, materials, labor, and overheads, which is nothing but a statement of equivalent cost per unit. Then it asks us to compute the cost of finished output and closing work in progress, which we shall do in our statement of evaluation. And finally, we need to prepare the process account. So let's zoom in so that we can see the numbers clearer. And here we have our first account, which is a statement of equivalent production. We always start with our opening work in progress. So in our question, we have been given that our opening work in progress is 1,500 units. So in particulars, let's go on to write opening work in progress. So opening work in progress is our input, but these units will go on to become our output or finished goods. So we will write it in both columns. Next, we have our raw materials introduced. Raw materials introduced is the same as materials, and here we have it input of materials 18,500 units. And this is our input. So we shall write raw materials introduced input 18,500. Now these 18,500 units of raw material will go on to become our finished goods. In our previous question, we found the finished goods by finding the difference between our input and output column. So in our previous question, we summed the input column and the output column and found the difference, and that was our finished goods. But here in this question, we have been given that the units transferred to the next process is 15,000. So this is our finished goods. So 15,000 is our finished goods. But something to note over here is that these 15,000 units, which is transferred to the next process, is inclusive of the output or finished goods that we get from our opening work in progress. So the value that we will write here will be 15,000, which is given in the question. So it says units transferred to next process 15,000. So we are going to write 15,000 minus our opening work in progress, which will also become finished goods. So we subtract that, which is 1,500 to get a finished goods of 13,500 units. Let me explain this again. So we are told that finished goods of 15,000 is going to be transferred to the next process or to process 2. So this 15,000 includes the output that is going to be coming from our opening work in progress. As we said before, opening work in progress will go on to become finished goods. So this 1,500 is included in 15,000. So while writing our finished goods here, we will subtract this 1,500 and write 13,500. Next, we have normal loss. Normal loss is given as 10% of total input, which is opening work in progress plus units introduced. Here, I want to mention that sometimes normal loss can be on current input. If the question mentions that normal loss is on current input, we will calculate the normal loss percentage only on raw materials introduced and not on opening work in progress. But in this question, they have mentioned on total input. So this will be on the sum of opening work in progress and raw materials introduced. So this is going to be 10% of 20,000 because we get 1,500 plus 18,500 as 20,000, which is our total input. So 10% of 20,000 is going to be 2,000. Next, we have not been given anything related to abnormal loss. The question hasn't specified what unit scrapped is. So let's move on to write our closing work in progress. We have closing work in progress of 5,000 units. Now that we are done with this, let us total the input and output columns to see if we have an abnormal gain or an abnormal loss. So on totaling the input column, we get a sum of 20,000. And by totaling the output column, we get a sum of 22,000. This means the output column is more. This is a case of abnormal gain. So we will write abnormal gain. And over here, we see that our input is less than our output. So normally we would write 2000 on our input column, but abnormal gain is an output. So we will write the difference on the output column, but in negative terms. So we will write minus 2000. So here we saw that our input is less than output, which means there is an abnormal gain. If you remember the process account, we accounted for abnormal loss on the debit side. But over here, we know that abnormal loss is an output. So we will show this in the output column, but we will show a negative figure so that this account will tally. So after this, we get a sum of 20,000 as input and 20,000 as our output. Now let's go on to find our equivalent production. So for opening work in progress, we are given that the degree of completion is 100% for materials. This means all the work has been completed last year and no work is left for this year. So this year's amount of work will be 0% and the units will be 0. For labor and overheads, we are given that 33 1 by 3rd percent of the work is completed. This means 2/3 of the work is left, or 67.67% of the work is left. So I'm just going to write is equal to 2 by 3, which is nothing but 66.67%. And similarly for overheads, I'm going to again write 2 by 3. This is the work left for this year. Last year, we have already completed 1/3 of the work. Now to find our equivalent production units, we are going to multiply 2/3 with 1500 to get 1000. Same goes for our overheads. 2/3 of 1500 is 1000. Next, we have finished goods. So finished goods output is 13,500 units, and we know that 100% work has been done on our finished goods. So percentage will be 100% for materials, labor, and for overheads. So 100% of 13,500 is 13,500 itself. Next, we have normal loss units. And as we saw in our last question, no work has been done on normal loss units. So we will write 0% and the units as 0. Next, we have closing work in progress. For closing work in progress, we have been given the degree of completion for materials as 90%. So 90% of the work is being done this year. So we write 90, and 90% of 5,000 is equal to 4,500. For labor and overheads, we have done 30% of the work. So 30 and 30. So 30% of 5,000 is going to be 1,500. The same will go for overheads. Next, we have our abnormal gain. So abnormal gain, we take 100%. Though not mentioned here, our abnormal gain will go on to become finished goods. So we take 100%. So all of this will be minus 2,000 because 100% of minus 2,000 is minus 2,000. Now let's sum to find the total equivalent production for materials, labor, and overheads. So for materials, we have got an equivalent production of 16,000 units. For labor, we have got 14,000 units. And finally, for overheads, we get a sum of 14,000. So if you notice, our abnormal gain is a negative figure. So this will get subtracted. So our equivalent production for materials is 16,000. And for labor and overheads, our equivalent production is 14,000. Our next account is our statement of equivalent cost per unit. We already know the format of this account. So first, we have our element of cost. Our first item is going to be materials. For materials, we are given that the cost is 52,000. So we will mention this in the first rupees column. Then from this, we subtract normal loss realization. So in the question, it has been mentioned that normal loss is 10% and scrap value is rupees 2 per unit. We have already found that the normal loss units is 2,000. So to find the normal loss realization, we will multiply this 2000 with our scrap value of rupees 2. So 2000 into 2 will give us 4000. And this 4000 we subtract from 52,000 to get 48,000. Next, we have labor. So the cost of labor in our question is given as 14,000. So direct labor is 14,000. So we will write this in our third column. And finally, for overheads, we have been given the cost as 28,000. So again, we write this in our third column. Next, we fill in the equivalent units that we have found from our statement of equivalent production. So equivalent units for materials is 16,000. Equivalent units for labor and overheads is 14,000. So we find the cost per unit by dividing the amount by equivalent units. So here for materials, a cost per unit is going to be 48,000 divided by 16,000. We get a cost per unit of 3. Similarly, for labor, we're going to divide 14,000 by 14,000 to get 1 as the cost per unit. And finally, for overheads, we will divide 28,000 by 14,000 and get a cost per unit of 2. By summing this, we will get the cost per unit for our entire one product or one unit. So this is our total cost per unit. Let's go on to our third account, which is a statement of evaluation. So in our statement of evaluation, we find the values for various elements. We first start with our opening work in progress. So for opening work in progress, the costs are split in 3 parts, which is material, labor, and overhead. Now, equivalent units, we will take from our statement of equivalent production. So the equivalent units for materials is 0. So we will just write 0. Next, opening work in progress labor equivalent units is 1000, and so is for overheads. So we will write 1000 units for labor and 1000 units for overheads. Next, cost per unit we have from our statement of equivalent cost per unit, which is 3 rupees for materials, 1 rupee for labor, and 2 rupees for overheads. To find the total cost for materials, we will multiply the units with cost per unit. So 0 into 3 is going to give us 0. We will do the same for our labor and overheads. So 1 into 1000 is 1000, 2 into 1000 is 2000. We will sum these to get our total value for opening work in progress. For opening work in progress is 3000. Next, we have our finished goods. So again, 3 parts of the processes, how costs are divided: material, labor, and overhead. If we go back to our statement of equivalent production, we have equivalent production units as 13,500 for materials, labor, and overheads. We will write this here as 13,500, 13,500, 13,500, and go on to our cost per unit. The cost per unit will be the same. So 3 rupees for material, 1 rupee for labor, and 2 rupees for overheads. Let's quickly multiply this to find out the total cost for material, labor, and overheads. With this being done, we can sum these 3 values to find the total of our finished goods. After this, we have our abnormal gain. So for abnormal gain, we have materials, labor, and overhead. Our units is 2000, 2000, and 2000. Here, let's write minus 2000, minus 2000, and minus 2000. Cost per unit is same, so we have 3, 1, and 2. Now, over here, we don't multiply minus 2000 with 3 and write minus 6000 because cost of any production cannot be negative. So we took these negative figures so that we can write abnormal gain on the output column and balance these two columns. But doesn't mean that our cost to prepare these abnormal gain units will be negative. So our cost will be positive. So we will simply multiply 2000 with 3 and write the figure as 6000. Similarly, we have our labor cost of 2000 and overhead cost of 2002, which is 4000. Let's sum this to get the total value for our abnormal gain. Finally, we have closing work in progress. Now let's go and check our equivalent units for closing work in progress. So for materials, we have an equivalent units of 4500. So let's write this down. Moving back to our statement of equivalent production, for closing work in progress, the number of units, equivalent units for labor and overheads is 1500. So we will write the same respectively in our statement of evaluation. Cost per unit is the same. We have 3, 1, and 2. Let's quickly multiply these values to find the total of our closing work in progress. With this, we are done with our statement of evaluation and we can move on to our process account. We start with our opening work in progress. So we write to opening work in progress. Number of units given in our question is 1500 at rupees 15,000. I mentioned this in the previous question that for our process account, we don't take opening work in progress value from our statement of evaluation, but we take it from our question. So in our process account, we will write 1500 units at an amount of 15,000. So we have units 1500, an amount 15,000. Next, we have two materials. Materials introduced is 18,500 units valued at rupees 52,000. So let's quickly write this down. Over here, I would like to mention that in some questions, we might be given transfer from process A. So this is our input or raw materials introduced. So we have been given 800 units valued at 1,05,070 in our previous question. But along with this, they might also give us two materials. So what do we do when this is the case? So we are given transfer from process A, which is our raw materials introduced. We've been given 800 units, 1,05,070. But along with this, we're also given two materials, which doesn't have the number of units, but has a cost. So in this case, there will be two changes or two effects in what we do. Our first effect will be in our statement of equivalent cost per unit. Over here, the format is going to be, first, we write our raw materials introduced. So I'm just simply going to write raw materials introduced. Let's take up imaginary figures. So let's say our raw materials introduced is 2000 units at an amount of 40,000. And we have also been given materials. We have not been given number of units, but we are given that this amounts to 15,000. Now, to show this in our statement of equivalent cost per unit, we will simply write materials, and write the amount of 40,000. And then we will write additional materials. So additional materials and write this 15,000. We will add these two values to get a sum of 55,000. So from this 55,000, we will subtract normal loss realization. So from 55,000, let's say our normal loss realization is 4,000. So by doing this, we will get an amount of 51,000. And then we will go on to divide this by our equivalent units. So our first effect is going to be in our statement of equivalent cost per unit, where we first write materials like we normally have, write the amount, then we write add additional materials, which is this 15,000. We total this to get 55,000, and from this we subtract normal loss realization like we normally do. So after doing this, we get the total amount or net amount for materials, which we divide by equivalent units to get cost per unit. If this effect is clear, let's move on to see what the second effect is. Our second effect will be in our process account. So first, we normally write two materials. We write the number of units and the amount. But let's say we have this additional materials of 15,000. We will simply write two additional materials, nothing in our units column, and 15,000 in our amounts column. So these are the two effects when we have been given both in the question. If this is clear, let's continue with our question. So after our materials, our next expense is labor. So we write to labor. Our labor expenses is coming up to 14,000. Direct labor, 14,000. We will go mention this on the debit side of our process account. Next, we have overheads. Our overheads is coming up to an amount of 28,000. So the cost of overheads is 28,000. Next, we can write abnormal gain. So we know that abnormal gain comes on the debit side. So we will write to abnormal gain 2,000 units. And for the amount, we will take this from our statement of evaluation. So we have an amount of 12,000, and this is what we will mention in our process account. Coming to our credit side, we first have our normal loss. So normal loss units is 2,000, which is 10% of inputs, or 10% of 1,500 plus 18,500, which is 10% of 20,000, which is equal to 2,000. We have been given that scrap value is 2 rupees per unit. So our normal loss, 2,000 units. To find amount, we are going to multiply 2,000 into 2 to get an amount of 4,000. Next, we have our finished goods. I have already mentioned that we don't take units of finished goods from our statement of equivalent production, and we don't take its amount or value from statement of evaluation, but this is going to be our balancing figure. Next, we have our closing work in progress. So we have by closing work in progress, we have been given the units of closing work in progress as 5,000 units. And as for the amount or value, we will take this from our statement of evaluation. So in our statement of evaluation, we have found that closing work in progress amounts to 18,000. So I'm going to mention this right here. Let's just remember this once again. So in our process account, abnormal gain, abnormal loss, and closing work in progress, we take from our statement of evaluation. In this question, we don't have abnormal loss. We have abnormal gain, which we took from our statement of evaluation. And for closing work in progress, again, we took the value from our statement of evaluation. But for finished goods, we don't take anything from the statement of equivalent production or from the statement of evaluation, but we find the balancing figure. So now let's total all these columns to find our units of finished goods and value of finished goods. So first, for units, on our debit side, we have 22,000, and on our credit side, we have 7,000. So let's subtract or find the difference to find our finished goods. So we have 22,000 minus 7,000, which gives us 15,000. If you look closely in our question, we were given that units transferred to the next process is 15,000 units. So here we have it, 15,000 units. So if you look at our statement of equivalent production, our finished goods is 13,500 plus our opening work in progress also goes on to become our finished goods. So both of these together are our total finished goods. So 13,500 plus 1,500 is 15,000, and that is what we have here in our process account. And as for the amount, we have 1,21,000 minus 22,000, which gives us 99,000. Let's check if this is right. We have our checkpoint to find if what we did so far is right. So first, we take our opening work in progress. So under opening work in progress, we have two parts: percentage of work that has been completed last year and percentage of work that has been completed this year. So what is the cost for the percentage of work that has been completed last year? This is being given in our question as 15,000. So work done on opening work in progress last year is 15,000. Work done this year is 3,000. So this together will be the cost that it takes for these opening work in progress goods to become finished goods. So 15,000 plus 3,000, we get 18,000. Where did we get these values from? I'm repeating this once again. 15,000 is what it costed on these opening work in progress goods last year, and it has costed 3,000 this year to finish the work on these opening work in progress. So totally on these goods, it has costed us 18,000. Now let's go on to our finished goods. Finished goods, we take the value from our statement of evaluation and we get 81,000. Over here, let's also mention the number of units. So for opening work in progress, our units is 1,500. And for finished goods, we have the units as 13,500. Now together, that is for 15,000 units, we have our total finished goods as 15,000 units. And to find the amount, we will add these two values, that is the cost of opening work in progress and the cost of finished goods. 18,000 plus 81,000 is 99,000. And if we see, this 99,000 matches or is the same as the 99,000 that we got in our process account. So if these two amounts match, then the question is right and we are done with our second question. Let's just take a look at the different accounts and wrap up for today's video. So in our first account, we calculated the equivalent production for materials, units, and labor and got a figure of 16,000 equivalent production units for materials, 14,000 equivalent production units for labor and overheads. Next, we had a statement of equivalent cost per unit where we found the cost per unit. The three parts of the processes, materials, labor, and overheads, they turned out to be 3 rupees, 1 rupee, and 2 rupees respectively. Third, we had our statement of evaluation where we found opening work in progress, finished goods, abnormal gain, and closing work in progress. And finally, we prepared the process account and checked if we got our answer right. Few things that we learned different in our second question is one, we saw that finished goods was given in the question as units transferred to next process. So in this case, we have to subtract our opening work in progress and mention the remaining amount here like we did. So we got 15,000 in the question as being transferred to the next process. And in our finished goods, in our statement of equivalent production, we wrote 15,000 minus 1,500, which is 13,500. Another difference was our abnormal gain. We took a negative figure on the output side, but while coming to calculate our costs for abnormal gain, we took positive values because expenditure on making abnormal goods or any goods cannot be negative. Then we learned that sometimes we might be given raw materials introduced and materials together. So in this case, we saw that there are two effects. One in the statement of equivalent cost per unit, where we have to add materials plus additional units, and from that we subtract normal loss utilization. The second effect will be in our process account, where we show both the expenses, two raw materials introduced and write the figure, then two additional materials and we write the figure. So with this, we are done with our question 2. In today's video, we have learned the equivalent production using FIFO method. And in the next video, we are going to learn the equivalent production using the weighted average method. You'll find the cherry on top quiz in the description below. This quiz will help revise and summarize everything we have learned in today's video. After giving the quiz, you will find the solutions to all the questions. And if you are one among 3 highest scorers, then you have a chance to get a mention in my future videos. Don't forget, I take accounts tuitions for class 12 CBSE. Do like, comment, and share this video if you found it helpful. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all very soon.